Throughout this episode of Grief in Common, we talk about sensitive subjects including road traffic accidents and suicide. Hello everyone, welcome back to the second Grief in Common podcast by Winston's Wish. We're going to be talking about individual experiences of grief, those things we have in common, those things that we don't have in common. My guest today is Maya. We're going to be talking specifically about grief and mental health, so there should be some good discussion. So Maya, how you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you doing?
Very well, I'm very well. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. You'll have to bear with me. This is my second episode hosting, so I'm just getting to grips with everything. I'll just give you a little introduction about myself, kind of why I'm here, and then it'd be great to hear your side. So, my story is when I was 21, my mum was unfortunately hit by a car while she was out on a bicycle ride. It was, I suppose, a serious impact of the brain, and while she was kind of alive for a year and a half, we ended up withdrawing hydration and nutrition, and she died at the family home. So I was 22 when she died. So I'm probably, one of the older ones you'll see in the Winston's Wish and on these podcasts. But yeah, you want to tell me a little bit about your experience?
So mine, very different, but I guess similar in a way. So when I was 5, my dad took his own life. He drove to France for reasons that I still don't know. I have in the back of my mind that my mum told me he always wanted to go to France, so maybe that was it. But he drove there, and so yeah, it was difficult that it happened in France. I think that complicated things a lot for my mum, especially in terms of getting him back to the UK and the police response and things like that. But he did leave a note, which I am very grateful for, because I think quite a large number of suicides don't leave a note. It was quite a graphic one in the sense that he detailed the whole process, essentially, from when he got to France. It's a very long note. It's probably like 3 pages long. My mum showed me when I was kind of old enough to understand it a bit. But he sort of made 2 attempts on his life before that he kind of documented that, which was a strange experience to read. I think losing him at 5 has definitely shaped my grief in a very particular way, I would say. I've probably experienced more of the anxiety side because I lost him at a young age compared to probably what you've had losing someone when you were older, in terms of the actual sadness and the memories and things like that.
Yeah, I'm really sorry to hear that, Maya. Thank you so much for sharing. One of the things that I kind of chatted about with Ghislaine was that specifically the timing of the bereavement really affected both how Ghislaine and I managed it. So yeah, I can imagine at 5, that seems very young. Do you have any memories of your dad?
Yeah, I do. It's definitely not loads, and they kind of just come to me as and when. Like, if I was going to think of a specific memory with him, there's very few that I would be able to just sit and kind of pick out of my brain. I think probably a lot of them are from what my mum's told me about him as well. She's always been extremely open about the whole thing, and I mean, I was 5 and I'm nearly 24 now, and she still talks about him all the time. Just little comments like, she'll be like, your dad loved this song, or this was your dad's favourite book, kind of thing. So I almost feel like I've learnt more about him since he's died, in a way.
And Maya, do you have any siblings?
I do, yes. I have a twin brother. It's had its pros and cons going through something like that with a sibling the exact same age and from such a young age, because I feel like we definitely went through lots of different phases, and we've definitely always from the word go handled our grief completely differently. I was definitely more withdrawn at the beginning. I wouldn't go to visit his grave or anything when my mum and my brother would. I wasn't really interested in talking about anything, whereas he was much more open with his emotions. And then as we got older, I feel like that gradually shifted And we used to be quite good at talking about that kind of thing with each other. And I think as we got older, I think we were just dancing around it more. We were both worried about upsetting the other one. And somewhere along the way, we sort of stopped speaking about it. And I would say that we don't anymore, which is odd because of what I said about my mum being so open with it all. In a way, I feel like whoever I'm talking to about it, I always feel uncomfortable. And I don't know why.
Yeah, I hope you're feeling, comfortable here. But, we talked about how you kind of handled grief. Before we go into that, what have been some of the effects that you've had or that you've found that have come out of your bereavement?
I think overwhelmingly, I would say probably in my relationships with people. Like I said before, it's not so much that I miss him or anything like that, or necessarily feel sad about it a lot of the time. I just think that I would be a completely different person if it hadn't happened. And the person I am now, there's a lot of things that I'm not necessarily a fan of that I think are definitely to do with his death and how it happened. I think with suicide, because he essentially chose to do it, that's been something very difficult to deal with, and then has sort of had repercussions, sometimes without me even realising it, like being a complete nerd at school, but to a kind of obsessive sense, just wanting to do really well at everything because I didn't feel like I was good enough. Because if I was good enough, then maybe he wouldn't have done what he did. So definitely that kind of sense. It's all the kind of subconscious things that on the face of it, I might not be like, oh, well, that's because my dad took his own life. But then when I actually think about it, that's a lot to do with it.
I know the feeling sometimes, you're talking kind of about the more grander scheme things, but sometimes when I'm having a down day, I just think, man, why am I so down today? And then it's like, oh, yeah, of course. You can try and hypothesize it and, point it to all these little things. But for me, I'm sure 99% of the time, it's just grief, just playing up. But, you talked also about anxiety. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
The bit I can remember most, because that's the thing, losing somebody so young. I know that it probably started a lot earlier than I can remember, but I was too young to kind of know what it was. And so the worst kind of part that sticks out to me is when I was about 15, and I just kind of developed really bad. It was mainly health anxiety, which kind of doesn't make sense in a way because he didn't die from an illness per se. But I was just constantly convinced that I was dying and that there was something wrong with me. And it was really just affecting my day-to-day life. I would go to school, but I would want to leave school. But then I would go to the nurse to be sent home. But then I was so afraid of going in there and getting ill that I wouldn't even go in. So it wasn't a great time. And also just constantly worrying that things would happen to my mum or my brother or other people around me. If I texted my mum and she didn't reply, within a few minutes, I would just start immediately jumping to the worst conclusions and panicking. And if she went away, definitely that was really bad as well. So mainly stuff to do with that. And to me, it seemed like it came out of nowhere, but in reality, it had probably been bubbling for years and was bound to overflow at some point. Did you ever experience that kind of thing, anxiety?
For me, no, not really anxiety. It's interesting you talk about, if your mum goes out and you don't get a reply, you start getting anxious about that. And I definitely have that. If I call someone and it goes straight to voicemail, I always think the worst. And that's kind of a direct consequence of, the occasion in which I found out about my mum's accident. My brother got a call and then he started calling my dad and my dad called me and my brother and we were all calling each other and couldn't get hold of mum. It just went straight to voicemail. So now, whenever I call a number and it goes straight to voicemail, it's just a little bit eerie. But, anxiety's not really been an effect of mine. Mine was initially anger. When it first happened, I went and lived abroad for a few months as part of my university. And I remember just being so angry. And I was going to the gym 4 or 5 times a week and I was boxing and that sort of, I love exercise, but that intense physical exertion, that was very new to me. And I think in hindsight, the reason I could go to the gym 4 or 5 times a week and all of this was because I was using my anger as like an energy source. And I've definitely found, as more time has passed since the bereavement, I've just got less angry, and I've just not had the desire or the energy to do any of that tough physical exertion. But I do still get quite down from it sometimes. It's become much less frequent. And again, shortly after the incident, 2 days a week, I was probably seriously down to the point where I couldn't do university work. And over time, it's got easier. I think part of that is just time being a healer, but also understanding coping mechanisms a bit more, understanding what works for me and what doesn't. And not anxiety, but just a general sadness that comes and goes still.
It's interesting that you mention anger, actually, because that's something that I never really experienced. And I think, it's a natural reaction to grief anyway, but I think especially with suicide, people are angry because I think, obviously for me and my brother, it came out of nowhere. I don't know if my mum, it obviously was a shock to her, but in some ways she saw it coming. But regardless, it's a shock, and you're angry at them for leaving you in whatever situation they've left you in. Like, my mum wouldn't have been a single mum for the last however many years if he hadn't left. But it's never really something that I've experienced, and part of me was waiting for it to just hit one day, but it's just never really happened. But my brother was similar to you, and that's sort of how his grief came out, in the form of anger. I don't know if you would have experienced this since you were university kind of age, but I feel like my school was pretty rubbish at dealing with it, especially in terms of him, because they couldn't see why he was acting that way. They just saw him acting that way and kind of just punished him, really. So yeah, interesting that you mentioned that, because it's such a common reaction to grief, I think.
Yeah, well, my domestic university here was very good. In Sheffield, they were very, very good. When I was studying abroad, not so good. But yeah, again, our conversation just reminds me of the conversation Glenn and I had. It's the way in which you lose someone really affects how that grief then manifests itself. So it's really interesting talking to you and, losing your dad in such a different way. Really, I see the differences in how you and I feel and how we manage with things. When you're feeling anxious now, is there anything that you do to kind of help address that?
I think I've just got my comfort things. So it's lame, but Friends, the TV show, has just always been a really huge source of comfort to me since I was old enough to watch it. And I don't know what it is about it. I think it's just because it partly is just so normal. It's just a group of friends doing normal things that groups of friends would do. And it just kind of grounds me. Because I've never been the kind of person that, took up running or, started ballroom dancing, I don't know, all this stuff. I've probably had quite basic coping mechanisms, but they work for me. And I think as well, forcing myself sometimes to get out of my comfort zone, kind of weird compared to what I just said, but can really help me. If I'm having a day where I'm feeling really anxious and I've got something planned in the evening, every bone in my body just wants to stay curled up in my room watching Friends, which sometimes is fine. But I often find that if I do actually force myself out and I'm around other people, that's quite calming in itself. And that often I'm worse if I just sit in on my own. So I think probably a mix of just being a hermit and watching Netflix and forcing myself out and being around people and around my friends, because it just acts as a distraction and it takes my mind off it. And that's especially with the health anxiety, actually, because a lot of the time I don't get it nearly as much as I used to, but it will be little pains that I notice in my body and I'll just start focusing on it. And then I'll blow it up and I'm like, well, this has got to be serious. I'm obviously dying. I can't think of anything else. And then as soon as I go to a pub with my friends or something, I realise that I've not thought about it for 2 hours and it's obviously not been hurting and it was all in my head. And that's comforting in itself.
It's really interesting to hear you say that, and I think, whether that's, I know friends, I love friends to be fair, but they have that, there's that coffee shop, Central Perk, and it's all of them sitting together in that coffee shop, and whether, you're watching them sitting together in that coffee shop, or you yourself are sat in the pub with all of your friends, it's just that, I suppose, escape from reality, isn't it? You talked about being distracted, and it's interesting you use the word distracted, because for me, I think distraction is good, but equally, when I'm distracted, I sometimes find I'm not thinking about it, which is nice, and it's respite for me. But sometimes I do need to actually engage with it. It might not be pleasant, but I know by going out for a run and thinking about mum, it might be uncomfortable for a little while. But actually, it's just important for me to do that. So, you talked about not wanting to go out and see your friends, but you enjoy doing it, when you do go. And I don't know if that's all the time. Maybe sometimes you go out and you think, I'm just going to go home, which I definitely do have. And I'm not the voice of authority here, and I'd never want to prescribe to anyone, go out and do the things you don't want to do. But I think it's important to push yourself beyond these comfort zones, because, not just do they make us grow in general, I think, but it's important because, if you are sat there feeling like you don't want to do anything, that can sometimes be a bit of a cycle. And sometimes you need to break that and go out and do the things you don't want to do. And you might feel better for it and you might not, but at the end of the day, you found out, what coping mechanisms work and what don't.
For me, seeing my friends is a distraction, because personally, I've never really spoken or opened up to my friends much about what's happened. For the same reasons, really, that I was talking about earlier. I just feel uncomfortable about it and feel like I'm making them uncomfortable. So, everybody close to me knows about it and knows what happened, but I don't necessarily, if I'm feeling bad or anxious about it, I don't talk to them about it. They're like my distraction. But I don't know how it is for you, and if your situation's different, whether seeing your friends, they're like a source of comfort for you and that you feel like you can talk to them about it. I don't know, what your experience has been.
So I found, on average, my male friends aren't so good about, talking about these things. There are exceptions, of course, but as a whole, I wouldn't want to go to the pub with all my guys and talk about it. But I find that I very much lead the conversation, which I think is, the case with, most interactions when you're talking about grief. I think you almost set the rules and people kind of follow that. So, I find that if you're quite shy about talking about it, the other person won't really touch on it. Whereas if you're quite open, they will tend to be quite open. Not always. But I think I probably talk about it less than I used to, but I think because for me talking about it was a coping mechanism, whereas I don't need that coping mechanism so much now. But I found myself talking about it less, but that doesn't worry me. I think it's just, the kind of natural progression of these things.
Yeah, I mean, people always used to say to me at the start, it never really gets easier. You just kind of learn to live with it. But I do think it gets easier. It definitely gets easier. It makes me feel bad sometimes, but I can go days, weeks, and that's probably because I lost my dad when I was so much younger, without really thinking about it. It doesn't, affect my life constantly all the time anymore. So if anyone's listening to this thinking that they just can't see a point where they'll ever feel normal again, it does happen at some point.
I suppose how your dad died and my mum died, both, impact from vehicles, essentially. I know that, a lot of other causes and, underneath that. But I sometimes find when I tell people that, I don't like to shy away from it. I just say, unfortunately hit by a car while she was out on a bicycle ride. And I sometimes see people wincing at that, when people ask. And I think they're almost expecting you to say, give a different answer, something they can probably palate or swallow a little bit more. And I've had a lot of people initially, when it's kind of come out, my mum's dead, they say, is it natural causes? I sometimes think, what do you mean by natural causes? I don't know. I don't know what you're asking and what you're expecting me to say to that. Impact from a car, is that natural? How is it any more natural than, old age? Or, I think it's very interesting, that sort of terminology around it. So
when people say natural causes, when it's somebody our age that has just said that they've lost a parent, I don't know, apart from incredibly old age, how natural any kind of death that age could be, you know. I don't know, surely they know that when they're asking that kind of question. But I mean, we have quite different responses, I think, in that way, because I would love to be more like you and just come out with it as it is. And that's definitely how the approach that my mum took eventually, because she just got fed up with people saying to her, like, oh, I'm sorry to hear that, you know, Jamie passed away. And she was eventually like, well, he didn't pass away. It was, you know, a lot more horrific and violent than that. And I'm just going to say it if you're going to ask me. But I'm definitely more, I don't know, I guess appeasing, because the second somebody asks me, oh, you know, about my parents, for example, and they assume parents, often I don't correct them. If I don't think it's going to come up again, I'll just let them think that I've got two parents, because I'm like, well, what harm's it going to do? If I, you know, if I start going into it, it's just going to make everybody uncomfortable, and I don't want to do that. And if it does come up and I have to answer, I just hate it immediately. I usually just say, I don't have a dad, and hope that they leave it there. But obviously I had a job interview once, actually, probably when I was about 14. It was like my first ever job in a pub, literally washing dishes. And I had like an hour and a half interview with the guy there. And he was like asking loads of questions about my dad. He was like, because he asked me the same thing. And I said, yeah, I don't have a dad. And he was like, oh, well, why is that? Are your parents divorced? And I was like, well, no, like he died. And then he was like, well, how did he die, if you don't mind me asking? And I was like, well, I kind of have to say now, don't I? You've kind of forced it out of me. But I just find it so uncomfortable, and I really wish I didn't, because I feel like I'm playing into the stigma that is around suicide by being like that. But I just hate the wincing that you mentioned and the silence afterwards, because people don't know what to say, and it's just horrible.
I don't think, you know, you're feeding into it as such or anything like that. I think, you know, coming on here and talking about it is, you know, I really appreciate that. And I imagine it is very tough to talk about it. Like you were saying, it's a very different process of death and bereavement to someone who, you know, didn't die by suicide. So, no, it must be, you know, very difficult to talk about. And it's funny when people are persistent with those sorts of questions. And, it happens quite a lot, to be honest. But, yeah, kind of talking about language as well. The language around suicide, you know, I understand is also that there's a lot going on there. How do you normally phrase it?
I think I'm quite bad, because I do tend to say committed suicide, and I know that that's now not the way that you're supposed to refer to it, and I completely understand why that is. But I feel like from the age of 5, that's how I've been referring to it. And it's hard to like get out of that. And I mean, take your own life is obviously the one that I'm trying to adopt now. But yeah, that tends to be the one that I've gone for. Definitely not passed away, because I mean, it just doesn't make any sense at all. But yeah, I would say that one. And every time I say it, I'm like, I shouldn't have said that. But it's hard to get out of the habit.
Like you said, it happened when you were very young, and I think you should never feel bad or guilty for how you choose to describe your own experience. You know, that's your experience. It's your grief. How you want to talk about it to other people, that's your decision. And I think you can own your own grief. You can own your own bereavement. Now, however you want to say it to people, whatever way that makes you feel comfortable, you know, I think that's the way to do it. And I think for me, just being upfront about it and saying, this is what happened. And I think part of that is also to get people to stop talking about it. People are so, you know, quite frequently taken aback by it that they don't carry on talking about it, which I always appreciate. So, yeah.
I mean, what do you tend to go for in terms of how you kind of word it?
I say it was, there's a few things. I say traffic incident, you know, to the point I just say, you know, she was hit by a car and unfortunately, serious brain trauma. I say, you know, she was then in several different hospitals. She came home for the withdrawal of hydration and nutrition, which I say, because it's not ending life support in the way that people think, where you switch off a machine and that's that. It was very much, we're going to stop feeding, stop providing hydration. And I also don't like to say passed away, because for me, I think, and again, it's completely personal, and however people choose to say it, that's fine. But for me, I think it detracts from what happened. It was very tragic, and I don't want to dance around the subject and say passed away, because I think that's covering it up, and I think she deserves to have it told how it really happened. So Maya, we talked a lot about the language that we use when we talk about grief and bereavement, but there's also the period before the grief and the bereavement, before that person's actually died, and there's definitely words that people use. And when my mum was in hospital, people were talking about fighting. They were saying, oh, she's strong, she can fight this, she can get through this, she's a fighter. If anyone can get through it, it's her. And when she did die, it kind of raises the question of, if that was your mindset, what did she do wrong? Was she not strong enough? Was she not fighting hard enough? Did she not want to live? That's not how I see it at all. She was completely unconscious the whole time, and it was physical trauma, and there's no amount of fighting, I think, or no fighting you do in that situation. And I guess sometimes with mental health issues, there's the talking about battling mental health things. So I just want to know what you think about that, and if anyone ever used any of that language to you, or if you your thoughts on that use of language.
And I mean, I'm sorry that must have been really difficult for you, because I sort of know what it's like in a way, but I think it was probably my mum that would have got more of that immediately afterwards. It's probably the assumption that there is some mental battle going on. Again, I don't like the word battle, it's an illness like any other, he didn't lose by taking his own life. It's ultimately what he decided to do. It doesn't mean that, he was overcome by anything. I completely agree with you. I think with him as well, it's tricky because I was so young. So I don't know for sure, but my mum tells me that it wasn't a clear-cut case of mental illness either. He obviously wasn't okay, because I don't think anyone can be okay to do something like that. But it certainly wasn't as black and white as, oh, well, he had a mental illness and then as a result he took his own life. So it's irritating when people use language like that, because it's not even always applicable. Just because someone's taken their own life, it doesn't mean that they were suffering from a mental illness or, battling demons or anything like that. He just had his own struggles and he didn't feel like he could keep going. And I mean, I agree with you that it's very problematic.
I don't know about you, Maya, but what I have found is, yes, it's very difficult sometimes, and there are days where you don't want to go outside. I think, for me, I've definitely found that I have become more sensitive to people, but that's because I've become more sensitive myself. And I find that's, slightly therapeutic sometimes. And I was listening to Stephen Fry's Desert Island Discs not long ago, and he was talking about his bipolar. And, someone said, would you get rid of your bipolar if you could? And he quoted someone else and he said, don't take my demons because my angels will go too. And he was saying, it's so difficult, but it makes me who I am, and I wouldn't change who I am. There's flip side to everything, and it's important, I think, to take these things and move forward and just acknowledge that you're growing with them as a person, and growing stronger as a person.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And I don't think I would be remotely the same person that I am if, he hadn't died. I just, it's obviously got its negatives and its positives in that sense. But in some ways I wouldn't change it. And it's probably made me a better person in some ways.
How have you found pursuing romantic relationships later on in life, or also non-romantic relationships after suffering bereavement?
Yeah, tricky to navigate. Definitely less so friendships. That's never really been an issue. It's more when I get that close to somebody in the romantic sense. I've had relationships since then that might have worked out differently if I hadn't had that kind of attachment style. And it's just when I let myself get that close to somebody, it becomes all the more scary that one day they could just be gone. And obviously, I'm only 24, well, nearly 24. You know, most of the relationships I've had up until this point obviously weren't going to be, you know, the person that I'm going to marry. But it just hurts so much every time, because it feels like, to me, that person has died. Because it feels like I'm grieving them in a way. One day they're there, I'm seeing them every day, spending all this time with them, and then they're just gone and it's over. And I find that so hard, because it does feel like I'm grieving them and that I've lost someone kind of in that way again, even though it's not the same. Yeah, what about you?
Yeah, it's interesting you say, you know, they're different experiences, and they are different experiences. They're very different experiences, but it is, you know, it's the same kind of outline, and that there is this person that you're talking to every day and that you are very close with, and the next day they're not. So I think the fact that you would feel that you've lost someone, you know, after a relationship ends, and I can understand how that would feel like a slight, you know, a feeling of bereavement, and then how that would then feed into that initial fear of losing someone again. And it sounds, you know, like a pretty tough cycle. Yeah, I sympathise with you, and I'm afraid I can't offer any kind of prescription on that. But I found it, yeah, same thing. I, you know, started seeing someone about a few months after my mum died, actually. But, you know, it was, you know, still like a year and a half-ish after the incident. And I really struggled at the beginning of that, just being convinced that that person wasn't going to be there the next day and that anything could happen. And it, you know, we talked about, you know, when they don't reply, you think that, you know, the worst has happened. And I do get that still. But to begin with, it was much more, you know, kind of existential, you know, nothing certain, anything can happen at any point. And this person who, you know, I'm seriously starting to have feelings for could, you know, not be there the next day. And that's really tough. And, you know, it does feed into that initial experience of grief and bereavement. So no, I can totally relate.
And that makes so much sense with the way you lost your mum as well. Yeah, it's so tricky to navigate. And I think part of mine as well is, and it's again like an attachment style thing, because of the way my dad died. You know, in a way he chose to leave me. And so I find myself subconsciously, like 90% of the time, pushing that person away at some point, because I'm like, you know, how far can I push them to see if they'll stay, basically, because that person that was supposed to be my dad chose to leave me. So why would this person here that says that they love me stick around? And obviously it ends up biting me in the ass, because, you know, it's not pleasant for somebody to be doing that to you. Yeah, it's so tricky. And yeah, that's something I would change, definitely.
Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me, Maya. I really, really appreciate it. The main takeaways that I've got from this, first of all, has just been around language, the kind of language that we feel comfortable using, the kind of language that we, you know, feel comfortable when others are using. And, you know, knowing what language we like doesn't come straight away, and I don't think it comes easily either. It's a process, and I think that's really about learning, which again has been another thing that I've really taken away from this. You know, when someone said to you, you know, this is going to be it for life, I think that, you know, it's a bit harsh. And I think it's a learning process, which I think will be with you for life. I don't want to say for definite, but I think, you know, I feel comfortable saying for me, I think I will be learning about this for the rest of my life. And it's going to be hard, but I think it's all about just moving forward with that and understanding there are going to be tough days, but there's going to be good days, and learning about your coping mechanisms. You know, you're only going to learn about them by, you know, trying them out and seeing what you do like and what you don't like. So yeah, you know, language, learning, and moving forward.
No, absolutely. And thank you for having me. I think it's just been refreshing talking about this kind of thing to somebody, because I rarely speak about it, and it's nice to just vent, I guess, to somebody that understands. So yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Grief in Common is a podcast run by the Winston's Wish Youth team. The topics of conversation aim to provide comfort and make a difference to other young grieving people over the age of 13.
We hope to give listeners the confidence to talk about their own grief journey.
It's rare to be able to listen to other young people being open and honest about their grief and how they're feeling.
We hope this podcast reaches young grieving people everywhere and helps them to feel less alone. From teenagers to young adults, students to professionals, we're all different, but we've all got grief in common.
Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. Thank you.